Namaste, everyone, and welcome to this second Sangha podcast. We're going to begin this podcast with a recap from last episode. So this is how we're usually going to begin every single podcast, is with a recap of the last episode, and then we're going to go right into the topics of the next podcast. So last podcast, I asked you guys for a name on this for this podcast, and as I'm writing the script, I've noticed only a couple of suggestions on this name. So I think that with over 100 views, we can do a little bit better. So I'm keeping the question still hanging for another couple weeks. What should we be naming this podcast? What do you want it to be called? It's completely up to you guys. Now, this can all have changed, and a lot of people might have given name suggestions since when I recorded, and man, that would be so frustrating and embarrassing. Another quick thing that I noticed is that the comments that I've received are all really nice, and none of them are really critical. Now, if everything's great, I have nothing to improve on, that's awesome to hear, but I highly doubt that. So if there's anything that I can improve on, please don't hesitate to let me know in the comment section below. I want to make this podcast the best that it can possibly be, and I can't do it without your help. Another thing is continue to share this podcast as more and more of these episodes start coming out so that we can reach more people as fast as we can. But without further ado, let's begin the main topics of this podcast. So our first topic is going to begin with a story from my life. Now, I'm sure many of you guys have gone to utsavs such as Vijayadashmi or Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh. And most of you guys, if you're listening to this podcast, have sat in bodhiks for all of these utsavs. Now, every year, when I was around 13 to 16 years old, I felt that the bodhiks given had one story always. It would always be about how Sangha was started, or it would be about how good conquered over evil. And it would be these same stories repeated over and over and over again. And for the first couple of years, I was always really confused. And it wasn't because the stories were confusing or the Vakta that was telling them was making them confusing. I understood everything perfectly. But it was the fact that they were repeated over and over and over again that really confused me. I didn't understand why 6 months later, the same story had to be repeated to the same people. Could they not just remember what bodhik was given 6 months ago, or what bodhik was given a year ago? And so one day I was fed up with this confusion, and I finally asked a Vakta. I asked him, why exactly do we keep repeating the same bodhiks every year? And he gave me a very interesting response. He told me that it's not that people don't remember the bodhiks, because they do. They really remember every bodhik, or some of them do. It's the fact that the utsavs give us a platform to remember these stories and remember the morals that we get from them. Now, that was a turning point. I realized that the same ideology applies here on this podcast. This is a brand new platform, and I think we should use this platform to remember the stories that we have heard so many times over again, and remember the morals that we get from those stories. So I think to fully understand how this podcast works and how we are going to get new information from this podcast and new understandings from this podcast, we have to go back and go to the origins of Sangh. So, without further ado, I'm going to begin the origins of Sangh. However, if you have recently heard the story and you don't want to hear me say it again, I completely understand. And feel free to click on this time code right here. And click on that time code and you'll be automatically directed to the exact moment where I begin my opinions on this, on the overviews and origins of Sangh. Okay, let's begin. The story of Sangh starts in colonial Bharat. In the early 1900s, Bharat was in its peak for Indian independence movement. Most of the movement was happening either in Bengal and northern India, but there was a strange young boy who was making his way through school in the city of Nagpur. His name was Keshav Baliram Hedgewar, and as a kid he was born a patriot. Now, as a kid he rebelled against the schooling system that the British had enforced. He did not understand why an oppressive ruler's birthday should be celebrated in a predominantly Hindu and a predominantly Indian schooling system. When he grew up, Keshav, he wanted to pursue medicine. So he went to Bengal to learn about medicine. But that wasn't the only thing he learned there. He picked up on the Indian independence movement and he joined it. Keshav Baliram Hedgewar saw problems in the society. He noticed that despite the vast expanse of cultural heritage and ethos that was present in Bharat, there was a lack of pride for said culture. Now, you might be wondering that why is a medical doctor or a medical student worrying about society? But though he was a medical doctor by profession, Dr. Hedgewar, more commonly known as Dr. G, was not interested in diagnosing the ailments to the body. He was more concerned about diagnosing the ailments to the society, and more importantly, to colonial Bharat. At the time, Dr. G noticed that some of Bharat was complacent with the fact that people from a foreign country were ruling over them. Some even saw it as a boon that the British are finally making India or Bharat more modern. They're making Bharat into a better place by wiping out all the history. Bharat, as Dr. G saw it, was also very disorganized, both politically and culturally. Because of this, Dr. G knew that something must be done. He saw three key problems with the status quo. Those problems were that the Hindu society was fragmented. The Hindu society had lost all their pride for their rich history. And the Hindu society had forgotten what a united society had led to in Bharat before. So to combat these problems, he knew he couldn't just go to the political system and change the political system. He knew he had to start with a younger generation. And it's not because the adults had no pride. It's just because the younger generation simply had not been complacent yet. So, on the day of Vijayadashmi in 1925, Dr. G started the first RSS Shaka in Nagpur. RSS, or Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, soon began to become a nationwide movement. Soon, instead of just one or two shakhas, it became into thousands and thousands of shakhas, with Swayamsevaks coming from all over the country. Fast forward to 1925, on a small ship going towards Nairobi. One Swayamsevak was on that ship and felt that he was missing Shaka. So he went onto the deck of the ship and started saying the prarthana. Soon another Swayamsevak joined him, and the first prarthana was done on a boat outside of Bharat. By the 1970s, Sangh had spread to 4 continents. Today, in 2017, Sangha is in 37 countries in over 4 continents again. Now, I brought this story up not because I wanted to waste time. I brought the story up so we can understand the work HSS is attempting to accomplish. In my opinion, I see a goal that we have yet to have accomplished. Now, you may argue that the origins of RSS have nothing to do with what's happening in HSS. And you might be partially correct in my opinion. Though we aren't working to free Bharat, and we're not in Bharat, we are still working to unite Hindus all over. I think before we continue, quick break, I should clarify the meaning of the term Hindu. When I use the term Hindu, I am referring to any and all people who follow the teachings of dharma, or the values that uphold society. We can go over the exact intricacies of Hindu dharma and those definitions in another podcast if you guys are interested. So if you're interested, leave a comment down below and we will see if we can do that podcast. Similar to colonial Bharat, I think that Hindus are not very united today. Now, I think we are fragmented, bickering about which way of worship is better, or which mandir is better, that you can't go to one mandir and you can go to another mandir. And I think that colonial Bharat should play a really harsh reminder about what a fragmented society leads to. It leads to complacency and even more fragmentation. Not to mention, the more fragmented a society becomes, the harder it is to bring back together. Now, imagine society as a crystal. If you break that crystal into 2, sure, you can put it back together. You can use some super adhesive and put it back together. Now, break that crystal into even tinier pieces, and it is harder and harder for you to put that crystal back together. That is what I imagine as a society. If the society is fragmented into 2 pieces, it's a lot easier to put back together. Whereas if it's fragmented into little tiny hundreds of pieces, it becomes a lot harder to put together. In Sangha, our vision is Vishwadharma Prakashena through Hindu Sanghatan. So the way for us to get closer to that vision is Hindu Sanghatan, or uniting all Hindus. Now, a big problem, in my opinion, is that we, as Hindus, don't have a firm understanding on what makes us Hindu and who we are. Dharma and Hindu are very subjective terms that have a very objective definition. What I mean by this is that the denotation or the exact definition is very clear, but the connotations are different for each person. My view of what the best dharma is different than maybe what another person's view is. In Sangha, our aim is to bring all those different connotations of Hindu Dharma together with the people that believe in said connotations. This way, we can unify the Hindu society. And the Hindu society is, in the end, just one part of the entire world. And I think once we unify the Hindu society, we are becoming one step closer to achieving Vishva Dharma Prakashena. So with this, I'm going to conclude our first topic of discussion in this podcast. What I want to know is, what do you guys think the problems are with Hindu society today, or are there any problems? I want to know your beliefs and your opinions in the comments down below. I also want you guys to know, do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Is the Hindu society today united, or is it not? Are we fragmented, or are we not? I want to know all the answers to those questions down in the comment section below. So our next topic is the key terminologies of Sangha. Now, when I was in high school, there's a funny story again. My history professors would always hand out a list of key terms. Now, if you are someone who has gone to high school in America, you know what these are and you know how much everybody hates them. Now, they were the dreaded flashcards that you would have to make as part of homework. And I never really understood the true meaning behind, or the reason behind those flashcards until now, until I started writing for this podcast. So you see, to understand the terminology used in a conversation is as important as knowing the language you're speaking. By understanding the terminology used in a conversation, you can have a more in-depth conversation with another person. Such is the nature of Sangha as well, right? I can have a conversation with you about Sangha, but if you don't know what I mean when I say Karyakarta, or when I say Swayamsevak, it really has no meaning for you. So let's go over some common Sangha terms or jargon together. So I'll just be going over the definitions of these terms, as some of them have meanings that merit their own bodhik or podcast. So if you want to have one of these terms detailed in depth, or you want to know my opinion on some of these terms, leave a comment down below and we will go over those terms. So our first big term is Sangha, right? What does Sangha mean? Sangha literally translates from Sanskrit into group, association, or union. So it is usually used in Shaka to describe RSS in Bharat or HSS everywhere else in the world. The next term is Shaka. So what does Shaka mean? Shaka means a branch. So for Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, a Shaka is one location where Sangha activities are happening. Same thing in RSS. The next big term is Swayamsevak. So Swayamsevak literally translates into volunteer. That is the closest definition in English that we have. Now, Swayamsevaks are more than just volunteers. They are those who do seva. So the exact definition of seva is a vast one and not one within the scope of this podcast. If you want, we can have another podcast on seva. Just let me know if you guys want to have one down in the comment sections below. Our next term is karyakarta. So what is a karyakarta? A karyakarta is, just as the name implies, a karya karta, or a work doer. A karyakarta is someone who works and does work that goes towards the mission of an organization. So a karyakarta of Sangha is someone who does work that propels Sangha towards its mission. Our next term is Bauddhik. So Bauddhik refers to intellectual activities. Now, Bauddhik also has a meaning of a talk or a lecture. However, in the general broader sense, Bauddhik means intellectual activities. The final term that we are going to discuss for this podcast is Sharirik. Sharirik means physical activities. For example, some Sharirik activities that we have include games or Surya Namaskar or yoga. There are a lot more jargon that is used in Sangha. However, I think as we move along through this podcast series, we'll go over each of those topics and definitions as they come up. So if you have any questions on exactly what something means, I'm sure anyone in the comments can tell you what it means if you still have questions, or it might pop up in an upcoming podcast. So with that, we are going to conclude this podcast. Now, what I want to leave you guys off with is a mission. So for each one who hears this podcast, I want you to send this podcast out to 5 different people. 5 people who you know have not listened to this podcast yet. And what I want you to challenge them to do is to send it out to 5 other people. So what this will do is it'll spread the message of this podcast as fast as possible. And hopefully we can get more names, jumping back to the beginning, we can get more names for what we can call this podcast. So, as always, if you guys liked this podcast, give it a thumbs up. If it has earned your subscription, hit that subscribe button. And I will see you guys in 2 weeks. Namaste.